Hello, I'm William Lafleur from the University of Helsinki.
I'm Francesco Durante. We, together with Marcus Kreger, have written the first chapter titled Extraction and Extractivism's Definition and Concepts. This chapter provides an etymological and ontological overview of the roots of extraction and global extractivism, and it highlights some forms of on-the-ground resistances. We define extractivism as a particular way of thinking and the properties and practices organized towards the goal of maximizing benefit through extraction, which brings in its wake violence and destruction. The chapter ascertains the inherently violent nature of extraction and identifies extractivism as its overarching logic. The four primary sections of the chapter delineate our argument by introducing our position through a brief review of literature, then laying out an etymological analysis, tracing the historical trajectory of an extractive ontology and how the ontology is contemporarily being resisted. The etymological analysis ascertains the inherently violent nature of extraction as the definition conferred to the concepts the qualities of strength and effort, often directed against a non-cooperative counterpart. But most importantly, extraction identifies a process that ultimately separates a part from a whole, always implying a degree of destruction. The concept of extractivism represents the overarching logic of extraction as revealed by the definitions of the ending suffix ism. Moreover, the etymological analysis also reasserts the conceptual relation between these concepts, and by freeing them from additional instantiations, provides a higher order definition of extractivism that can assist in reading diverse phenomena of our age.
So after establishing the etymology, we then challenged the supposed naturalness or universalizing character of what we identify as an extractivist ontology that's rooted in a historical trajectory based on a particular philosophical and cultural notion of natural law. And this begins in ancient Greece with Aristotle. It's then later codified in certain doctrines of Roman law, and it's carried through Christianity, and especially Thomas Aquinas, into the start of the European colonial period. And this genealogy is important because in the early days of colonialism, this supposed natural law was used to legally justify colonizing the Americas and elsewhere. So this interpretation, of course, required a systematic way of subjugating at first non-English and eventually non-Europeans as less than. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this is when theories of racial superiority and inferiority begin to develop in England and other European colonial powers, inviting a new and more violent era of this extractivist ontology. So then we end the chapter by highlighting alternatives to this ontology. We draw attention to the fact that resistance to this ontology has always existed, but it is now becoming louder and more visible as we face the destruction of life on the planet as one of its outcomes. So we point out that resistance movements that rely on distinct place-based affinities and which are viewed by protesters as non-commensurable and non-commodifiable, it's one possible and potent challenge to this kind of onto-epistemic logic of extractivism. So in sum, the chapter aims to provide an etymological base from which to understand the historical and contemporary trajectories of a particular extractivist ontology, hopefully opening some routes, not only for critical, but for transformational scholarship and activism.
Hi, my name is Katharina Glaab, and I work at the Department of International Environment and Development Studies, known as NOAGRIC at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences.
And hi from me too. My name is Kirsti Stuvøy, and I'm Katharina's colleague at the university, where we both teach and research international relations. For this exciting collaborative book project on extractivism, we wrote a chapter together called The Politics of Violence in Extractivism, Space, Time, and Normativity. So what are the main points and arguments in our chapter?
The aim of our chapter is to address more fundamental questions about how violence manifests on a conceptual level, In the case of extractivism, this means that there are direct and physical forms of violence, such as environmental activists being killed or indigenous groups being expelled from their traditional land. But violence also takes more subtle and indirect forms, which are less tangible and easy to observe. So in our chapter, we deal with these different manifestations of violence in a hyper-extractivist age.
Our motivation was to expand on and discuss these different dimensions of violence and extractivism. As scholars, we're committed to a global perspective, and we're both curious about how to explore the global. So in this chapter, we therefore work conceptually to elaborate on global-local interconnectedness regarding different forms of violence and extractivism. Concretely, we develop a framework by drawing on discussions of violence across various fields, including conflict research, geography, and anthropology. We link this literature to examples of violence and extractivism to develop our framework. And in this framework, we emphasize two main conceptual dimensions: the violent politics of space and the violent politics of time. So our framework elaborates space-time dimensions of violence in extractivism. In our chapter, we elaborate three features within each of the two dimensions. Now, to engage with our conceptual framework, we do recommend, of course, that you read our chapter. We do hope it can inspire, and we welcome discussions from all of you, from specialists on extractivism, students and activists, who from different positions and experiences deal with violence in extractivism.
Let us just highlight one argument here on the relation of temporality and violence. There's often a focus on the so-called spectacle of violence that ascribes violence a certain presence in the now. Spectacular violence can then be observed, documented, but also remembered, and therewith also facilitates immediate responses. In the case of extractivism, we can see that with burning oil fields, killings of people, or forced displacements, which are then also more likely to be reported and will subsequently lead to calls for action. So in contrast, there's also the invisible and temporarily dispersed violent effects on environment and people due to extractivist practices, which are often not represented. And these are examples of what Nixon would call long dyings, such as climate change and related vulnerabilities and inequalities. So how something can be addressed, remembered, and then acted upon when it's not represented in the now, that becomes an important and also political question for us.
So how do we see our chapter's contribution to the discussion of hyper-extraction in the current age? So our chapter builds on the recognition that the conceptualization of violence matters to what we see and what remains unseen when examining violent extractivism. We argue that conceptualization has normative consequences for research and activism on violent extractivism.
So our spatial and temporal framework, we hope that this can actually serve as a conceptual map to expand the discussions on the politics of researching violence in a hyper-extractivist age. And so by exercising more reflexivity about our scholarly responsibility when invoking a term such as violence in our research, and when we address how our conceptual and theoretical choices have implications for how the world can be understood and then ultimately also imagined to be changed.
So it is our wish then that our chapter can inspire reflection on the practices of research on violent extractivism. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paul Wapner, and I teach global environmental politics at American University. My chapter is called Thresholds of Injustice, Challenging the Politics of Environmental Postponement. Now that's a convoluted title, so let me just kind of lay out what the argument is. So this book is about hyper-extractivism, and my contribution is to suggest that hyper-extractivism is not something simply that the environmental movement responds to, but is partly responsible for. So what that means is that in the chapter, I talk about the emergence of the modern environmental movement in the 1960s and the 1970s. And what I do is explain that the narrative that the movement used at that time period was a globalist one, focused on global thresholds. So books like This Endangered Planet or The Limits to Growth and so forth, The Population Bomb, these efforts and the movements that were accompanying them were pointing out that we only have one planet, and given population growth and technology and consumption and affluence, that we are pushing up against those thresholds. And there's lots of insight there. But the problem with that narrative is that when we think about global thresholds as the measure of environmental harm, it takes a lot to get there. And so much environmental danger, harm, violence, and so forth takes place below that kind of threshold, and that gets lost. And this allows, and it generates what I call in the paper, a politics of postponement, because it means that governments and societies can keep deferring significant environmental protection efforts because what they're seeing doesn't raise to that level of conscious awareness because it doesn't cross these global thresholds. Also, it does this narrative, it lumps us all together and says we're on one planet and we just have to watch before we crumble or cripple the organic infrastructure of the planet itself. But we know that so many people are suffering and are on the frontiers of environmental degradation without those forces rising to that globalist level. For example, today, we know that we cannot let the temperature of the planet, the average temperature, go to over 1.5 or at most 2 degrees Celsius. But what does 1.5 or 2 degrees mean for victims of Katrina, or those living on the front lines who have had their lives destroyed short of this global threshold? So what this article, what my chapter talks about is, it suggests that there's almost what's often called epistemic injustice going on by this globalist narrative. And it's a call for coming back to look at resistance to community level, neighborhoods, peoples who are facing severe suffering and violence, and recognize that that is the heart of environmental degradation. And that should be the focus of the environmental movement's attention. So I'm thrilled to be part of this effort, and I'm honored to be part of this book launch. And yeah, these are tough things, but I appreciate the time to share these thoughts.
My name is Nick Middeldorp. I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Canada. I will be presenting the chapter Empowerment or Imposition, Extractive Violence, Indigenous Peoples and the Paradox of Prior Consultation, written together with Philippe Le Billon of UBC's Department of Geography. Our article looks at the role of prior consultation in the expansion of the extractive industries. Prior consultation is a widely lauded CSR principle, and especially in the Latin American context, an officially recognized human right for indigenous peoples. Based on own field research and a broad literature review that includes comparative and single case studies as well as country analysis across the globe, we draw the conclusion that prior consultation, as it is implemented in practice, enables rather than prevents destructive projects. As such, we see prior consultation as a soft power tool of our extractive age. Prior consultation processes take place in contexts of entrenched inequalities. We're seeing the imposition of state law on indigenous territories, the depoliticization of what are essentially political and ontological conflicts. States determine who is to be consulted, about what, for how long, and on what terms, by whom. In some contexts, consultations take place alongside the criminalization and harassment of project opponents. At best, prior consultation can be used by indigenous peoples to negotiate benefits or compensation for damage, but veto rights are not recognized in practice anywhere. At worst, consultations can be used by states and corporations to channel and disarm community discontent and opposition and to greenwash or socially legitimize harmful and violent projects by checking the prior consultation box or even fabricating a story of community consent where it is non-existent or contested. To link this to the discussion of hyper-extraction, this is the paradox of prior consultation. It was envisioned as a safeguard to protect local communities from the harmful effects of hyper-extraction, but we're seeing that prior consultation in many cases is no safeguard at all. In contrast, as a discourse and as a set of practices, we see prior consultation as being co-opted and instrumentalized by corporate actors to facilitate extraction. We do not wish to state that prior consultation as a principle is useless. Often the mobilization around the issue generates rights awareness, fosters mobilization and resistance, or provides an opening for alternative modes of withholding consent. But we do want to raise our concern that the stated goals of prior consultation, protecting indigenous livelihoods, ways of life, and self-determination are unmet. As it stands, as long as the right to give or refuse to give consent is not respected, participation in these processes may actually be detrimental to the interests of affected communities. So long as the rules of the game aren't changed in favor of those that prior consultation processes are meant to protect, we believe it worthwhile to explore other, at times more autonomous and potentially confrontational mechanisms of participation and decision-making.
My name is Garrett Grady Lovelace. I'm an associate professor at American University's School of International Service in the Global Environmental Politics program in Washington, D.C. in traditional Piscataway lands. I'm very honored to be part of this exciting book. My own essay chapter was called Leveraging Law and Life, the Criminalization of Agrarian Movements and the Escazú Agreement. It begins by listening to the movements on the ground. So the Via Campesina and other transnational agrarian justice organizations for the past few years have called out the crisis of criminalization of their movements, not just of the violence against their movements, but of the criminalization. So the essay begins by listening to this movement call for more research and analysis and action on this issue of criminalization. It begins by saying their names, following the Black Lives Matter movement ethos of saying Berta Cáceres, Lesbia Yanez, and all of the various hundreds and if not thousands of land and environmental defenders that have lost their lives and have been criminalized in the process of being killed by the collusion of state forces and insurgency forces around agribusiness and extractive industries. The essay and chapter then go into journalism's role of counting and accounting to kind of get accountability. So The Guardian, Global Witness, a lot of different journalists have done really heroic human rights investigations to try to track the information about the deaths and the criminalization, because part of what criminalization attempts to do is to hide away the land defenders and the life behind kind of a gaze of, this being all illegal and illegality. The essay then gets into why calling criminalization is so important. I follow the lead of Latin American indigenous legal theorists and critical race theory about how criminalization has been a key mechanism of colonialism for centuries, and then thinking through the calling it agrarian. So much of the research about criminalization focuses on these as environmental movements and land defenders. But in fact, when you actually look at the numbers, many of them come from agrarian movements about foodways and agricultural and land-based life and territorial claims. So I'm thinking about the agrarian crisis and agrarian justice as frameworks with which to kind of analyze how the criminalization process occurs and builds on a long array of coloniality. So the political ecologies of calling out criminalization is the main thesis of the analysis. And I'm really thinking through how criminalization attempts to deploy the law against communities. It depends upon impunity and extrajudicial imprisonment and executions, even as it nominally defers to and upholds legality as an alleged public good. So there's a disjuncture here that's a potential opening, a crack in the logic that shows a backtracking, a grasping at legitimacy. So agrarian movements are growing around the world and trying to actually get into policy. So at the UN level, at Truth and Reconciliation, various United Nations declarations on the rights of indigenous people, of landless and peasant movements. So I kind of chronicled the legal terrain as a battle for legitimacy and survival on the part of those resisting coloniality. The chapter concludes with the very novel Escazú Agreement. So this is the Escazú Agreement for access and the official name is the Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so this is really a legal treaty to defend and prevent criminalization of land defenders. There was many negotiations. I interviewed many of the authors of it, the Costa Rican embassy, over many years. It finally came into force last Thursday on April 22nd, 2021, which is International Mother Earth Day, which is a very auspicious kind of day for it to kind of go live as a treaty, because so many of the people whom it defends are indigenous communities who really ground their land and environmental defense in Pachamama or other indigenous articulations of Mother Earth. So the paper really culminates with more, a need for more research and community-led research and analysis on these processes of criminalization and the way that community groups are reclaiming the terrain of law and policy for their own good.
I'm Victoria Kieschel. I'm an architect and a faculty member in American University's Global Environmental Policy Program, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. The title of my chapter is Extraction and the Global Built Environment, Violence and Other Social Consequences of Construction. My chapter's contribution to the discussion of hyper-extraction in the current age is to broaden the concept of extractive violence as embodied by our built environment. I am hoping to make visible to readers the variety of ways that even our greenest and most spectacular buildings and infrastructure owe their existence to extractive violence, and an extractive violence which may be remote from us or perhaps only slowly revealed over time. The point is that construction is really a paradox, because construction involves destruction. Destruction not only of raw material stocks, but sometimes of local economies that may be excluded from the benefits of the resulting construction, destruction of the socio-spatial fabric of neighborhoods, and sometimes of the construction workers themselves. In the chapter, I focus on three forms of extractivism that are inherent in the design and construction of our contemporary built environment. And the first form of extraction is global real estate investment. That invests capital in the built environment for the future extraction of profit for investors. Second form of extraction, this trend towards hyperbuilding, as cities and regions are competing for global recognition and investment. And I talk about how the global design and material supply chains really feed this delirium of resource extraction, and how there's a mismatch between global expectations and local realities. And that may lead to increased social conflict and vulnerability to environmental degradation and climate change. And then the third form of extractivism that I talk about in the chapter is the displacement of humans and other species, whether that's due to necessity or perceived opportunity, whether it's experienced as self-extraction or self-imposed labor migration. The overarching goal of my essay is really to get us to reconsider our built environment, and to reconsider it not just as a post-construction material thing, but to reframe our idea about the built environment so that it is first and foremost a force in a web of socio-ecological relationships. And my chapter asks us to ask tough questions of the built environment way before construction, way before design, because whatever we build will certainly outlive us, as will its impacts. They will be of long, long duration. So some of the initial questions of extractive extent certainly involve these, raw materials sourcing, labor force exploitation, but then also these more social and political questions, such as who will benefit from the construction and how, whom does it privilege and exclude in terms of race, gender, age, or affluence? How will the construction alter regional or site ecologies? Is the construction adaptable for future demographics or needs, or in fact climate change itself. And finally, in the chapter, I put forth a series of recommendations for a reimagined development process for the built environment, a process that would span from pre-design through operations, through measurement and verification, and hope that we can all add to that process as citizens and inhabitants of the built environment.
Hi, I'm Judith Shapiro. I teach at American University in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I am Ife Li. I teach environmental studies at New York University, Shanghai.
And Ife and I have been working together on China's environmental authoritarianism. And so it was a great opportunity to contribute a chapter to this book. Our feeling is that China's rise has had enormous impact on the planet. And we wanted to explore not only the conventional, if you will, extraction of resources like grain and fossil fuels and minerals, but some unconventional extractions of resources. So the title of our chapter is Rethinking Extractivism on China's Belt and Road, Food, Tourism, and Talent.
One of the things that seems very important about the Belt and Road Initiative is its environmental track record. We hear a lot of people looking at issues such as the loss of biodiversity, coal-fired power plants, and the increased carbon emissions associated with that. And those are absolutely important. But at the same time, those aren't the only important issues to consider when it comes to the environmental implications of the Belt and Road, which is why in this book, we decided to pivot to some of those other areas in the Belt and Road Initiative that hasn't been discussed, that hasn't been analyzed by the academic community and the policy circles at large. We looked at 3 specific cases in the Belt and Road. They are the Dairy Belt and Road Initiative, the educational aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as tourism under the Belt and Road rubric. We look at, for example, under the Dairy Belt and Road, even though many of the developments between China and New Zealand, Australia, the Netherlands, or even Germany are framed as private corporations going outside China to explore business opportunities. But one of the things we have to recognize is that these Chinese dairy conglomerates are owned by the Chinese state by a very large contingent. We're looking at, for example, the Chinese dairy conglomerate by the name of Mengniu, which is 35% owned directly by the Chinese state. And these developments, whenever they go out, they would say, well, the Belt and Road aspires to build what they call a shared global community of shared human future. And in the case of the Dairy Belt and Road, they say that they aspire to build a global community of shared dairy future. So we're seeing a lot of these close alignments between Chinese private businesses and the state. The same goes for tourism. When it comes to developing tourism in Central Asia, a lot of these projects are utilizing Chinese state investments, Chinese technologies to appeal to Chinese tourists, making these recipient countries in Central Asia more dependent economically on Chinese tourists and the revenue that is generated from that tourism. And the same goes for educational Belt and Road initiatives, where we see the export of not only Chinese ideas and philosophies, but Chinese technologies and technical specifications and tools. All of that contributes not only to the worsening of the ecological condition, but also giving China unprecedented geopolitical leverage over its Belt and Road partners around the world.
So in sum, we can say that this form of extraction is extraction of control of supply chains, it's extraction of culture and sort of erasing of local culture and imposition of Chinese culture. And finally, it's actually extraction of human resources.
Hey all, my name is Whitney Richardson and I'm here to introduce Chapter 8, which I co-wrote with John Andrew McNeish, entitled Granting Rights to Rivers in Colombia, Significance for Extractivism and Governance. Among other things, I'm a research associate with Earth Law Center and a recognized expert by the UN Harmony with Nature Knowledge Network, and I believe you were already introduced to John earlier. Chapter 8 centers on Colombia, where there are now at least 17 distinct ecosystems recognized as rights holders, which have all come in response to widespread extractivism. In Colombia, this began in late 2016 when the Constitutional Court recognized the Atrato River Basin as a rights holder in response to a lawsuit against the state for failing to stop well-documented illegal mining along the river basin, which led to toxic contamination of the ecosystem, threatening both its human and non-human residents' ability to survive. These cases are meant to be seen as concrete manifestations of a larger global movement which seeks to grant legal rights to nature by a broad spectrum of advocates who recognize the power of strategic litigation. As the first Colombian nature's rights case and the first river case in Colombia, we focused on examining the Atrato River Basin. We discuss whether it, and by association, similar cases that followed, represent a convincing attempt to establish a new mode of environmental governance, one that actually mobilizes a more ecocentric approach to governance and accomplishes its goals of protecting nature and human communities who rely upon it. To address this, we explored available empirical evidence and considered two main lines of inquiry directed at the Atrato River case. First, what opportunities does the case offer river protection? And second, what are the practical challenges to implementation, including any challenges for riverine guardianship and any tensions it produces with established understandings of human rights? To start, we argue that the Atrato decision represents a significant development in environmental jurisprudence, inspiring a raft of similar efforts of governance, protection, and extractivism across the country and the world. Extractivism, and just imagine activism emboldened in the word extractivism, in this context being a term coined by Anna Willow, which refers to those activities which seek to question, confront, and tame extractivism, recognizing that the contemporary resource extraction industry is subject to contestation due to the havoc it wreaks. However, we also argue that existing evidence reveals that so far there's been little meaningful change in the socio-ecological conditions within the region and the governance process surrounding it. Our chapter concludes with a sense of pessimism, given the complexities of the political ecology in which the ruling must function. The Colombian state persists with a plan for economic development based largely on natural resource extraction, despite the well-known adverse socio-ecological impacts and increasing jurisprudence for recognizing nature's rights in the country. Although the decision has garnered significant attention as a novel approach to environmental protection, and while a new eco-political imagination has been activated, significant conflicts of interest remain cemented in local and national governance structures. The national extractive agenda continues to accelerate, and illegal armed actors continue to hold significant power throughout the entire watershed. The Atrato remains a minefield, both socially and ecologically. Now, to wrap up, this chapter adds to the discussion of hyper-extraction and violence in the current age because, like Willow suggested, the damage generated by extractivism creates the conditions by which extractivism becomes necessary for survival. The Atrato case exemplifies this concept. This chapter adds to the discussion by examining riverine rights as a subset of nature's rights in a hyper-extractive context rife with a history of overt violence. Following the 2016 peace deal, Colombia has crawled back to the top of the list of countries with the highest rates of assassinations against land defenders, those most impacted by harms generated by extractivism. Since nature's rights has been presented as a legal alternative to navigating conflict associated with extractivism, it's an important trend to examine for its merits and risks as a possible solution. Of course, the chapter goes into these merits and risks in more depth, so you'll have to read it to learn more. Thanks so much for your time.
I'm Christopher Shagnon on behalf of my co-authors, Sofia Hagelani-Alba and Sanna Hokkanen. We are all from the University of Helsinki Global Development Studies, and our chapter is Extractivism at Your Fingertips. To look at the main points, we begin by conceptualizing, delineating possible digital extractivisms. There have been three types discussed in literature before, one being gold farming, a second being cryptocurrency mining, and a third being data extractivism. We focus mostly on data extractivism, which focuses on personal data. And this is not just Facebook data, but it also goes into public records, health, police reports, and things like that. One of the big contributions of our chapter is we came up with a web of extractivism, showing how data extractivism connects to, drives, and exacerbates natural resource extractivism. We then get into the violences of data extractivism. We start by looking at the violence inherent in the data extractive system. Now, beyond the driving of extraction of natural resources, these systems aim to mediate how we interact with the world, our communities, and each other. So we focus a bit on the social damage, destruction, and pollution that are externalities caused by these systems that are designed to be addictive and designed to get as much data out of us as possible. We talk about how this is connected to the situation of being in a post-truth world, the spread of violent conspiracy theories, and so on. And we also bring up the issue that it's basically impossible to have any real consent when you're using something like Google or Facebook or anything like that. We then go on to data or algorithmic violence. Now, this is more about structural violences, and this is related to the usage of data and the algorithms that are designed to process data. There are a myriad of these types of violence, and they work in many different ways. But all of them deepen structural violences like inequality, segregation, racism, and sexism, and they do have violent impacts in the real world. Now, we finally get to violence in the real world. And this looks at how data extraction and algorithms can cause, support, and exacerbate violence in the real world. We look at China. Now, as a disclaimer, this is not because it is a uniquely Chinese problem. It absolutely is not. We mostly talk about the West in the previous section. But there is widespread data extractive technology across the country. And also there's more overt collusion between tech companies and the state. We get into the invasiveness and pervasiveness of facial recognition technology, official doxing of rule breakers by the government, and of course the surveillance state that has developed in the province of Xinjiang. Now, when we look at our contribution to the discussion of hyper extraction in the current age, I think that our chapter is very important. Of course, I'm a bit biased. It shows this kind of total extractivism concept from Dunlap and Jacobson, and we connect how data extractivism helps drive hyper extractivism. But not just that. We also show that hyper extraction is not solely pushing the limits of extraction in natural resources, but it's also a hyper extractive desire for new resources. And now our thoughts, our movements, our lives, ourselves have become a resource. And this hyper extractivism pushes from our planet to our very souls. Thank you.
My name is Simon Nicholson. I'm in the School of International Service at American University. It was my pleasure to contribute chapter 10 to this volume that looks at what's called carbon removal and the dangers of extractivism. So the basic setup for this chapter, carbon removal is an idea that large amounts of carbon dioxide ought to be removed from the atmosphere as a way to respond to climate change. And through the language of extractivism, we can think potentially of carbon removal as a type of de-extraction. The idea is would use the technologies and processes of carbon removal to clean up the mess associated with prior extractive wrongs. And so the leaping off point conceptually that I use here is to say, yes, carbon removal can be a type of de-extraction. Extraction itself is a neutral process. Every creature on the planet is involved in extraction of some sort, taking materials from the earth, using them in the processes of life. But extractivism is something different. Extractivism is a logic. And if carbon removal is developed according to the logic of extractivism, then that's going to be a problem. Because extractivist logics are about the overuse of materials, are about a destructive relationship between human beings and the planet. And so what I look to do in this chapter is to talk about the fact that we have an extractivist logic starting to be baked in to the way carbon removal approaches are being developed. The chapter looks at the various types of carbon removal approaches that are being talked about, everything from planting large amounts of trees as a way to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, through to technological response options like direct air capture, which is about building basically machines with membranes that would separate carbon dioxide directly from the open air. Any of these approaches alone could be a really beneficial component of humans' response to climate change. But again, developed according to an extractivist logic at massive scale, any of these sorts of approaches could be devastating. So what I do in the chapter is look at two different ways that extractivism as a logic is apparent in the way carbon removal is being developed. First of all, in our collective imagining of climate futures that involve carbon removal, and secondly, in the sorts of policies that are developing around carbon removal as an approach. So first, very quickly, just to think about the imagining of the future. One of the key ways that we collectively look at climate futures is through climate models. The way that carbon removal popped onto the policy stage was through the integrated assessment models, they're called, used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other authoritative assessments of the climate change situation. These models, the integrated assessment models, they have assumptions built into them, including big assumptions about long-term growth pathways for human beings, for the economy and for population, for instance. And so if you examine these models closely, you see an extractivist type understanding of humanity's relationship with the planet built into the workings of the models. And so it's no surprise that these models then spit out, hey, it's really hard to change direction and to, for instance, shrink the economy as a response to climate change. The models can't help us imagine those sorts of ideas. But what they can help us imagine are large-scale technological fixes for the mess that we're in. So the models produce a certain type of extractivist thinking about appropriate responses to climate change. And then when it comes to the sorts of policies that are being developed, one of the key things we're seeing in the United States, for instance, is that an imagined pathway to the use of carbon removal is through what's called enhanced oil recovery. That is taking large amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then injecting that carbon dioxide into abandoned oil wells, first to save that carbon dioxide under the earth, right, as a way to keep it out of the atmosphere, but secondly, as a way to drive out remaining oil and gas from oil wells that otherwise wouldn't be able to be used, right? And so carbon removal is being used as a way to maintain the current oil and gas economy. And if that is allowed to be baked in, then carbon removal doesn't live up to its climate response promise. In fact, it just accelerates the challenge of climate change. And so ultimately, the chapter is a warning. It's to say carbon removal is going to be needed. I firmly believe that based on where we are in terms of climate change. But if carbon removal is developed according to extractivist logics, then it's going to be immensely problematic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Watts. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I teach at the University of California at Berkeley. I'm a geographer by training, and these are the particular approaches that I bring to the hyper-extraction project. The title of my contribution to the book is Hyper-Extraction and the Global Oil Assemblage, subtitle, Visible and Invisible Networks in Frontier Spaces. The sorts of questions that concern me in this chapter have to do with the type of scale, or put it rather differently, as a geographer, the multiple scales at which we have to think about extraction. And in my case, I focus specifically on the oil and gas sector. I've worked in Africa for a long, long time, particularly in Nigeria, which provides the empirical case for my contributions. And the type of theoretical or conceptual framing that I provide in this chapter starts from the idea that most studies of minerals or oil and gas in my case tend to start with with a global view, namely to look at the mineral or the commodity as part of a global supply chain. It's produced, refined, moved, transported, and consumed across space. And you typically focus on those actors, the transnational oil companies in particular, that are involved in that. What I try to do is to think about two things. One is to think about, and hence the language, a global assemblage, is to be much more expansive about the nature of the actors and the types of agents that are involved in these global supply chains. And what I mean by that is as follows. If I think about the type of work that I've done in Nigeria, it's not only the oil and gas companies and the national oil and gas enterprises that are involved, but there are engineering companies, there are construction companies, there are various types of traders that are involved, international trading companies, particularly companies like Glencore. These are enormous trading companies. Plus, we have other sorts of actors that are part of this assemblage. We have advocacy groups who are concerned about human rights and environmental issues. In Nigeria, there have been various types of conflicts on the oil fields. They are part of this assemblage. So what I'm trying to do here then is to think expansively about what holds this very complicated industry together at various scales. And that for me is the attraction of thinking about a global assemblage rather than just a global supply chain. That's the first point. The second thing that I try to do is that if you think about this assemblage as a group of networks connecting actors in particular ways, then often the boundary between the legal and the illegal, the licit and the illicit, is often very porous. And what I focus on in my chapter is one aspect of that porosity, namely oil theft and illegal oil refining. And this is a large, not just a Nigerian, it's a global part of the global industry. And it uses the same infrastructure as the legal oil industry, oil pipelines, export terminals, but it's a very leaky infrastructure as well-placed politicians and military and criminal organizations steal and refine that oil. And so I use this as an optic into the way in which it's not just the scale of the assemblage, but it's also the nature of the actors themselves. And the boundaries between the legal and the illegal, the visible and the invisible work together. And for me, finally, this contributes to the hyper-extraction volume by, in some sense, then thinking about hyper-extraction in this more expansive way that I've just described. So the hyperness, if you like, is not only the scale on which we need to think about the industry, it's also about the multiplicity of actors and how it challenges us to think across scales and also simultaneously to think about the complexities of the legal world and the illegal world, the licit and the illicit, the visible and the invisible. Thanks very much.